Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another week of the Political Economy Podcast. This week, we will be exploring a current news story that has been rocking global markets and leaving many uncertain about their economic future. These are the Trump tariffs, which were discussed throughout his 2024 presidential campaign and early weeks in office, culminating in what he called Liberation Day. On April 2nd, the American president unveiled an extensive list of tariffs, starting at 10% tariff on all imports and higher tariffs on states that have larger trade deficits with the U.S. The list of tariffed products and tariff percentages have changed frequently, sometimes in as little as a few hours, creating massive uncertainty in the future of U.S. markets and leaving businesses and consumers unable to properly prepare for the future, resulting in U.S. consumer confidence hitting a 12-year low. So why is the Trump administration standing firm on this protectionist stance despite backlash from citizens, business owners, markets, and tariffed countries? Together with my colleagues, we will explore the historical use of tariffs, theoretical approaches, how the tariffs have impacted the U.S.'s neighbor to the north, Canada, and the short-term effects of global tariffs. My name is Berlyn.
I'm Kenley.
My name is Fiona.
And I'm Cole.
All right. I will start us off by discussing the historical use of tariffs in the United States. The use of tariffs is often based on one of the three R's: revenue, restriction, and reciprocity. The first American act regarding tariffs occurred in 1789 in order to garner revenue for the government and protect American businesses from international competition. In 1817, post-war of 1812 tariffs were approved to protect American manufacturing. These early acts were mostly about creating government revenue and protecting developing American industries. Then came the Civil War. This devastated the South, and tariffs rose to nearly 50% to help with Reconstruction. This caused prices to rise, contributed to 25% unemployment during the Panic of 1883, and economic decline. In 1913, the Revenue Act instituted a federal income tax. Tariffs continued, but the added tax revenue created large increases in manufacturing, construction, and technological advances like the telephone. This economic growth birthed the Roaring Twenties. In 1922, high levies and tariffs were introduced to protect domestic industries, and other countries responded with reciprocal tariffs. At the end of the 1920s, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates, which spread to Germany and Britain and slowed spending. In May 1929, the Hoover administration members introduced the Smoot-Hawley Act, which raised import tariffs to 20%. Trading partners retaliated and cooperation slowed. This resulted in the events of October 29, 1929, which is known as Black Tuesday. Massive stock sell-offs triggered a market collapse, lessened consumer demand, created mass unemployment, and decreased manufacturing output by 30%. This started the Great Depression, and the U.S. did not fully recover economically until 1939, when World War II created a heightened demand for manufacturing. Of the economic collapse, the sitting president, Herbert Hoover, said, "Economic depression cannot be cured by legislative action or executive pronouncement. Economic wounds must be healed by the actions of the cells of the economic body, the producers and consumers themselves." I think it is important to note, after this brief history of the ups and downs of American tariff policy, that tariffs can be useful. They can protect infant industries, shield American workers from competition from countries with more unethical labor practices, and protect industry in developing countries. However, broad, sweeping tariffs like what Donald Trump has announced will harm more than they will help. To be beneficial, tariff policies should be targeted towards a certain industry or product, not all global trade. It is important to also mention what Trump's tariffs will likely not do: bring manufacturing back to the U.S. or make products cheaper for the consumer.
Hey, Berlyn, why will manufacturers not return to the U.S. with these new tariffs?
Thanks for asking. It is unlikely that we will see manufacturing making a big return to the United States for a couple of reasons. One is the unpredictability of Donald Trump. It would be one thing if he announced tariff percentages and stuck to them long term, but his tariffs seem to rise and lower by the day, depending on how the other countries react. Why would a business owner invest the time and money to bring manufacturing lines from a lower cost country back to the US when they're not sure what the tariffs will be 1 week from now? We are also uncertain if these tariffs will last past this current presidential administration. Companies may be unwilling to come back to the US if they think the tariffs won't last longer than the next 4 years. Second is cost. Unfortunately, the reason why you can buy products for cheap is because of poor labor protections and dismal wages in manufacturing countries. Even if the manufacturer is forced to raise the cost of their goods by 20% or whatever the tariff is at the moment, it will still be cheaper for the consumer than if manufacturing were reestablished in the United States and producers had to pay Americans higher wages.
Thank you for that awesome history of tariffs in America and Berlin. Next, we will analyze the tariffs through different economic lenses to understand the benefits and risks of tariffs are, namely free trade and protectionism. So why protectionism and free trade? Simply because this has been a recurrent theme throughout the semester, but also because this is an ongoing debate amongst economics all over the world. Over the past week, we have been able to observe the stance of economic theorists on both matters. Smith, for instance, strongly advocates for free trade and competition. List, who favors protectionism since young industries had to grow before competing in the global market. Marx, who was critical of both since he overall did not favor capitalism. Polanyi, who was critical of free trade since he believed unregulated free trade constituted a lethal threat to stable market economy. And Keynes, who favored protectionism after the events of the Second World War and additionally favored some level of laissez-faire. The question of protectionism or free trade continues to haunt the world economies and modern economies. Let's define the protectionism and free trade. So free trade is a system where imports and exports flow without the imposition of governments' regulations, say taxes and tariffs. Classical economist David Ricardo made a compelling argument in favor of free trade when he proposed his analysis of comparative advantage, stating that free trade will benefit both parties if they have different opportunity costs of production. Protectionism, on the other hand, restricts trades between countries. This means imposing high tariffs, for example. The pros and cons of protectionism. Like List suggested, protectionism policies will typically only apply when countries' infant industries are in the stage of development, but once strong enough to compete in the global market, they will typically adopt free trade. Furthermore, protectionism also, protects countries from having to deal with cultural differences, deals having to be translated into foreign languages, foreign laws, customs, and regulations, currency exchange, market failure, and other tribulations that can be avoided when a country simply chooses to stay home. On the other hand, no nation has a capacity to self-fulfill all its needs. In other words, some countries are abundant in certain resources that others may lack, and vice versa. If a country adopts a protectionist measures, it is unlikely to fulfill its needs for the resources it does not naturally produce within the territory. For example, Cameroon is rich in cocoa. On the other hand, France lacks the ecological requirements needed to grow it. If France were to implement protectionist measures, it wouldn't be able to satisfy its need for cocoa. Furthermore, a country might claim that it has the technological capacity to manufacture what it naturally could not. Say, France could fake the ecological environment needed to grow cacao. However, this would not only skyrocket the price of the product, but it is also highly unlikely that the country could produce as much as it consumes. So moving on, the pros and cons of free trade. Overall, the literature on free trade seems to be more extensive and favorable. The common consensus amongst economists of the US at least is that free trade offers more gains for society than not. For instance, theoretical and empirical evidence suggests that free trade creates more jobs than it destroys because it allows countries to specialize in the production of particular goods where they have comparative advantages. What's more, free trade encourages competition. If there are taxes, there's no competition because people can't afford higher ratios. Where free trade might be challenging is on topic of infant industries, because these would struggle and most likely fail against a stronger and older international competition. Protectionism, in this regard, would allow them to first progress and then compete. Another issue of free trade is that most developing countries rely on producing primary products, but this has many disadvantages, namely the fact that prices can fluctuate due to uncontrollable factors such as the environment or demand. Lastly, free trade does not raise revenue for governments unlike protectionist tariffs. So the big debate. Advocates of protectionism defend 2 points. First, high wages countries such as the US cannot compete with low wage countries, which leaves the high wage countries facing unemployment or reducing wages, which is not feasible in most cases. Second, like other countries, America should manage trade to its advantages. This suggests that the US plays by the rules of free market while foreign governments supports target industries. What economists at Harvard Business School refute is the opposite. The US can, in fact, compete with low-wage countries because it has superior productivity, which compensates for high wage rates. Conclusively, most experts agree that free trade should continue to rule over America's economic market.
Hi everyone, I'm Kenley, and I will be talking about our country of the week. And this week it is Canada. And we will be talking about the major economic shakeups that have been happening recently because of the US's new round of tariffs unleashed by President Trump. Just for some quick facts, in 2024, Canadian imports to the US were estimated at 762.1 billion US dollars, with US exports to Canada being roughly 350 billion US dollars, which is slightly lower than it was in 2023. This may seem like it's a really large trade deficit, but it is surprisingly one of the US's smallest trade deficits. And Canada is the US's largest export market and has been for so long because the two economies are super deeply intertwined. If you don't know, a trade deficit is something that occurs when a country imports more goods and services than it exports. This means that it is spending more on foreign products than it earns from selling its own. So the main imports that the United States receives from Canada are about 117 billion US dollars worth of petroleum oil, 27 billion dollars worth of cars, about 20 billion worth of petroleum gas, and then 15 billion worth of refined petroleum. Today, we are going to be looking specifically at the automotive industry and how Trump's new tariffs are going to affect the car manufacturing and selling. These tariffs, unsurprisingly, have drawn heat from both sides of the aisle, so much so that even Mitch McConnell emerged from his shell long enough to declare that, quote, tariffs are a bad policy and trade wars with our partners hurt working people the most, end quote. This is a bold take from a guy who's spent decades slow crawling through Congress like a turtle on NyQuil and still follows Trump with the blind loyalty of a Roomba vacuum endlessly bumping into the same wall. But anyways, back to the tariffs. First, let's talk about why they're actually a disaster. First, we have to understand how tightly intertwined the US and Canadian auto industries actually are. We're not talking that like they're just neighbors, they are basically inseparable. A single car might cross the US Canada border 6 or 7 times before it is fully assembled and then ready to be sold. Trade relations between the US and Canada are dictated by the rules of the USMCA agreement, which stands for US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. This is formerly known as NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, and it was renamed to reflect updated trade rules and to politically rebrand the agreement as more favorable for American interests, and this was done in Trump's first administration. But under the USMCA, cars can move tariff-free across borders as long as at least 63% of the parts are made in North America. That number was actually bumped up to 75% in recent updates to encourage more regional manufacturing. This system has worked like a charm for decades. It has lowered costs, sped up production, and overall made cars more affordable for consumers in both the US and Canada. But now, with Trump coming in with his economic wrecking ball, which is a 25% border tax on Canadian-made vehicles and a 10% import tax on Canadian oil, gas, and electricity. Why is Trump doing this? Allegedly, Canada has violated the USMCA rules, particularly in the agriculture, dairy, and lumber sectors by protecting their own industries too much and blocking US products. So basically, Canada is giving more priority to Canadian goods being available in stores than US ones. They're also being accused of giving unfair subsidies to Canadian farmers. Whether those claims are in fact true or just creative excuses for all this trade drama, the outcome is clear. Trump's America's First tariffs are kind of screwing everyone over, but especially the Americans. These tariffs were meant to hurt Canada, but they're really just backfiring onto Americans. For car manufacturers and sellers, because the two supply chains are so deeply intertwined and cars can cross the border so many different times, it is difficult to quantify what parts of the car were actually made in Canada and that are going to have this extra tariff tax added onto it. As a result, manufacturers are uncertain about how to price their cars, which compounds the economic disruption of these tariffs. To summarize, these tariffs have already disrupted supply chains, jacked up prices for American consumers and Canadian ones, and slowed down car production in US factories that rely on Canadian parts and energy. It's basically like trying to punish your neighbor by setting your own house on fire and then hoping that they inhale the smoke. It's just really not smart and it's not going to work very well. Also, it must be noted how these tariffs are really impacting hardworking people in both the US and Canada. In Ontario, which has the largest automotive sector in Canada, the Premier Doug Ford, who is like the Prime Minister of Ontario, has warned that about 500,000 jobs could be at risk. Most of these jobs are part of assembly lines or supply chain roles. In the US, in states like Michigan, Ohio, and Tennessee, where auto manufacturing is a big industry, they could also see job cuts, specifically for Ford and General Motors, because of the higher cost of production due to tariffs. Automakers would be forced to scale back their operations to offset these costs, and this job uncertainty is not a good thing if the US does not want to see economic collapse. Because as we know, money needs to keep flowing in a capitalist economy, and when people are uncertain about their jobs, they tend to save their money. This is just one big feedback loop of declining customer spending and economic slowdown. It's kind of like trying to drive a car with no gas in it. It doesn't really work. And to think all of this damage could be unavoidable without Trump's tariffs. Tariffs are meant to protect domestic industries from foreign competition, boost local employment, and reduce trade deficits. They also give governments some leverage in trade negotiations, and their benefits are often temporary, and they cause more harm than good in most cases. In just the few days that the tariffs were enacted, Canadian manufacturers already saw increased costs from parts that came from the US, which ultimately means higher prices for the Canadian and US consumers. On the US side, automakers, mostly in Michigan, were seeing production delays because of disrupted supply chains and already higher prices in cars. And here's the best part of all these tariffs. We've seen it before. In 2018, Trump slapped Canada with tariffs on steel and aluminum and said it was for, quote, national security. But, nothing screams national security threat more than Canadians and their maple syrup. And in return, Canada slapped the US back with tariffs on orange juice and wine. The fallout of this wasn't beneficial for the US. Instead, Canada diversified its trading partners and started leaning more towards the EU and Asian markets. So, the lesson Trump should have learned from all of these tariffs is that tariffs don't build friendships. But I guess lessons are really kind of hard to learn when you're stuck playing golf with billionaires every weekend in Florida. So, are tariffs and protectionist policies actually sustainable for the United States? It's not a clean cut answer. Protectionism can help during crises, such as COVID, by rebuilding local production and reducing reliance on foreign powers. And hey, national security is a big deal, but protectionism often comes with baggage. Inefficiencies, bad blood with allies, and the rise of weird chest thumping nationalism that makes international competition feel like a group project gone wrong. Free trade, on the other hand, keeps economies growing, prices low, and partnerships strong. But it's not a magic bullet either. Outsourcing can deepen inequality, and the environment often gets the short end of the stick when profit takes the wheel. That's why it's not about all or nothing. Instead of scrapping free trade, maybe it's time to upgrade it. Think fair trade with teeth, stronger labor protections, environmental standards, and actual accountability. Agreements like the USMCA are a step in that direction. They give us a rules-based system to settle disputes and keep the economic engine running smoothly. But when tariffs get thrown around like dodgeballs, especially for weak reasons, it just wrecks the system for everyone. So bottom line, The Canada case shows us that tariffs might win headlines, but they lose the long game. They strain alliances, hike prices, and jam up the industries they claim to protect. If we want real economic security, we need to trade that smart, fair, and future focus, not a temper tantrum wrapped in red tape. With auto the situation has temporarily calmed, offering a brief sense of normalcy to the industry. However, the uncertainty surrounding the future of these tariffs continues to weigh heavily on both Canadian and US trade partners. The Canadian auto industry, which is deeply intertwined with the US supply chain, depends on predictable and stable trade conditions to operate efficiently. Automakers and part suppliers often make long-term decisions about production, investment, and employment, but the looming possibility of tariffs makes those decisions much riskier. This uncertainty disrupts planning, delays investments, and can ultimately increase costs for consumers as companies hedge against future trade disruptions. While the 90-day pause has prevented immediate economic fallout, the threat of reinstated tariffs still casts a long shadow over one of Canada's most vital export sectors.
Okay, thank you for the case study, Kenley. I will now talk about a more general effect of the tariffs. So once the tariffs were implemented, there was a general negative response. Markets plunged and companies began laying off employees. Leaders around the world began warning of the negative impacts these tariffs would have. The managing director of the IMF said they clearly represent a significant risk to the global outlook at a time of sluggish growth. Additionally, JP Morgan increased their probability of a recession from 40% to 60% once the tariffs were announced. The markets also responded harshly, with the S&P 500, the Nasdaq, and the Dow dropping nearly 6% the Friday after they were announced, the worst week since COVID in 2020. But why is there such a negative reaction and uncertainty in the markets? Well, for the most part, it's because these tariffs were much larger than people anticipated. The tariffs were calculated using a simple formula, which is trade deficit divided by total imports divided by 2. This formula led to a much higher tariffs than the 10% across the board tariffs that were generally anticipated. Countries targeted by the tariffs responded with retaliatory tariffs. China responded to the tariffs with 34% tariffs, the same amount that was imposed on them. The European Union responded with 20% retaliatory tariffs. Other countries with less economic leverage attempted to negotiate the tariffs. Turkey, for example, responded with a statement attempting to move closer towards free trade with the United States. After a pause on tariffs for countries who did not retaliate, the US and China's tit-for-tat tariffs began escalating into a trade war, the US imposing 145% tariffs on China and China responding with 125% tariffs of their own. In addition to just retaliatory tariffs, China also put export controls on rare earth minerals, a sector that the United States imports nearly 70% from China. Trump and his Treasury Secretary Besson have begun making statements that they do not want to enter a trade war with China and have floated the idea of easing tariffs in order to de-escalate the situation. Earlier, I mentioned a pause, but what led to Trump pausing most of the tariffs? Well, the combination of extreme negative response from the stock market as well as rising yield rates from bond sell-offs led to Trump announcing a 90-day pause for those who didn't retaliate. With the economy being a large part of Trump's presidential campaign, the hit the economy took from the tariffs was an unsustainable position for the Trump administration. Although there is still uncertainty regarding the implementation of future tariffs, with there already being 2 90-day pauses on tariff announcements this year, it appears that the level of tariffs that were announced on the so-called Liberation Day will not return.
So, what do we think?
So, having understood the difference between free tariffs and protectionist policies, I think I agree with most scholars when they say that free tariffs can be more beneficial to the economy, especially when it comes to such a powerful economy as the USA that is a leader in the world market. And there is no necessity for protectionist policies. Additionally, I also agree with Kenley when she says that there needs to be an in-between point with not free tariffs necessarily, but fair tariffs, where this concept of free tariffs evolves to include more progressive stance on issues that are now very prominent on the world, such as the environment and labor rights and such.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think the main problem here is these tariffs are not specified to target a certain industry. They're on everything on every country, which causes a lot of uncertainty, and does not, do the job that a tariff is supposed to do. And it also will likely turn a lot of the world away from the US and maybe more towards China, for economic partnerships. So I think that these tariffs have really shown, how powerful the United States is on the global stage, and has really rocked a lot of the US's relationships with their allies.
Yeah, I would agree. I think as well that the tariffs won't accomplish their goals, which are to bring manufacturing back to America, and that's mainly because it's so unpopular on both sides of the political aisle that the companies are generally expecting them to be undone with the next administration, so they're not going to invest billions of dollars to bring manufacturing back to the US for like a short-term fix.
Yeah, I completely agree with everyone and what they're saying, especially considering the automotive industry. We've already seen such slowdowns in supply chains, and people are going to lose their job because of this. And it's making a lot of people, especially US citizens, unhappy with Trump. And so I think that that will also push for a lot of these tariffs to kind of fizzle out and go away. And with that like discontentment, I guess, with the Trump administration, I could totally see a bunch more countries choosing not to become an ally with the United States in terms of trading or cease trading or anything like that. So, yeah, I agree with what everyone's saying.
All right, and that was this week's edition of the Political Economy Podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next week.